So, you're thinking of buying a new TV and you're thinking, understandably, of 4K. So, what are the 5 must-haves that you need to look for in your new shiny TV? Let's check it out. Number 1, 4K. It's pretty obvious. Of course, your TV must be a 4K UHD TV. Anything that's produced in the last 3-4 years most certainly will be a 4K TV. Make sure it says 4K UHD TV. Quite obvious, but you never know. Number 2, look out for a TV that has a breakout box. Now, a breakout box is basically a separate box that's a tiny little thing that connects to your TV via a small, thin cable. The importance of that is that's where all your bits and pieces will connect into, including your Sky, your satellite, your TV aerial, whatever it is you're connecting, including game consoles and so on. What that saves is an awful lot of spaghetti at the behind your TV, so it makes your TV look a lot smarter and nicer when it's on your cabinet. I thought I'd find the word there somewhere, or on your, wherever it is you're putting it. Certainly if you sort of have it on a wall or anything like that, which I wouldn't recommend, but if you have it on the wall, you've only got a tiny little cable. In terms of like the more modern TVs, they have this little fiber optic cable, which is really, really cool. So that's all you pretty much have running down your TV. Some even manage to run the power through it as well, but those tend to be the higher end ones. Number 3 is make sure it's a smart TV. Now, a smart TV basically is a TV that will run an operating system. LG have their own version, so does Samsung. They use Tizen, some use a version of Android. The basic premise of it is that they're able to download apps. Apps allow you to use services like Netflix, Amazon Prime, or surf the web, and do a whole myriad of things. So make sure it's a smart TV. It also enables that when you're setting it up and when you're using the TV, it makes for a much nicer experience. It's a lot easier to use, it's more intuitive, it's less clunky. So look for smart TV features. Number 4. Now, one of the biggest changes since 4K arrived is HDR. Now, HDR is high dynamic range. Basically, it's a means of simulating how your eye perceives light and dark, and that's represented in a fashion on your TV, so it gives a more natural feel to images, and that allows for brighter images, better colors. Everything feels that little bit more real, and you get a real sense of differences in light and the feel that gives to you. It's just a much better experience. In fact, some are saying that HDR is the real game changer for TV, more than 4K was. The thing that you need to look for as a minimum is HDR10. That was pretty much a Samsung thing, but it's sort of spreading out into a couple. HDR10 is basically 1,000 nits. Now, 1,000 nits is the amount of light output by the panel. Now, a HDR10 panel will put out 1,000 nits. That's the sort of bare minimum or a minimum for a good HDR experience. Those started coming out around about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, so look for that as a bare minimum. Certainly if you're looking at a second-hand TV and it has HDR, make sure it has sort of HDR 10, certainly if it's a Samsung, it may just have HDR on it. Look for, if you can, on that model for the output in nits. Ideally it needs to be 1,000 or more. We then moved to HDR10 Plus, which is the more later version, the more modern version of HDR, predominantly mostly from Samsung again, and that's 1500 nits. It's a much brighter experience, and it's basically 1500 nits plus. We're getting sort of more to an extreme end of the HDR outputs that we're seeing. Those came in the last sort of couple of years or so, and also either have HDR10 or HDR10 Plus or Dolby Vision, which are very similar. In fact, Dolby Vision is a better version of, some are saying it's better than HDR Plus. The jury's still pretty much out, and then there's HLG and advanced HDR as well. They're all versions of HDR. HDR10 Plus, Dolby Vision, HLG and advanced HDR are all recent tech. So make sure your TV has one of those. It's very unlikely to have all of those. And then at the bare minimum, sort of HDR10, or if it just says HDR, look at the model and then look for the output in terms of nits, and you can find that online. You should be able to find that online, and that'll give you a great experience when you're watching HDR content. A lot of that now is put out by Amazon Prime and Netflix. They do a lot of HDR supported material and 4K, as well as, of course, if you're watching 4K Blu-rays as well. If you've got a 4K Blu-ray player, a lot of those will be HDR as well. Now finally, number 5 is remember me mentioning the breakout box and where all the HDMI connectors are? Well, you need to make sure that at a minimum your the connectors, the HDMI connections, are the standard of 2.0A, 2.0A. That basically means they can handle up to 18 gigabytes of data. The reason that's important is that is kind of considered the standard for 4K 60 frames per second with HDR. That's the amount of data that you're pushing through that cable. And also make sure that your HDMI cables are also 2.0A2, otherwise it's not going to work particularly well if you're connecting a console or a 4K Blu-ray player or anything like that to your TV. So always make sure it has that. The higher end, more recent models will have the latest version of the HDMI standard, which is 2.1, which can handle 48 gigabits, which is a huge leap. It's not a software update, so if you've got 2.0A, you can't then upgrade to 2.1. It's a hardware thing. So if you can afford it, and the TVs that you're looking at, the differences are on those HDMI standards. If you can afford to, go to the 2.1, because that will future-proof you for a good number of years. 2.0A is going to be around for a very long time, but if you really want to future-proof, make sure, and you have the available cash to buy a much more recent, higher-end set, look for 2.1. And finally, just as a sort of a number 6, even though it's not really mentioned, you can look for game mode, but it's not really a requirement. The reason I say that is that all that game mode really does on sets is it turns off all the processing and degrades the quality of the image slightly to make things a little bit quicker. 99% of that you can do within the settings itself, and if you've calibrated your TV, there's lots of calibration settings and how-tos in my channel that you can see, and yeah, you need to turn off a ton of processing, because that'll slow up your TV and it tends to make the images look very artificial. In fact, Tom Cruise puts it very well in this video that you'll see as a card coming up now. So I hope all that is helpful to you. just the 5 sort of golden rules when looking to buy a new 4K UHD TV. Make sure it's 4K, breakout box, make sure it's a smart TV with apps, HDR with the various versions of HDR, and then HDMI 2.0A as a minimum, or ideally, if you have the budget, 2 HDMI standards of 2.1. There we have it. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and I hope that's been useful. If you've not subscribed, consider that. Also, I really appreciate it if you can give me a thumbs up. Always very welcome, helps the channel enormously. And if you want to know of the more videos that I've done as I'm doing them, click the bell and make sure that you're alerted of when I've done those. Thanks again, and I'll see you very soon.